Hey guys, I am so happy to welcome my friend Jerry Dugan, who is a podcaster. I met him through the Christian Podcasters Association group that we were both in, and I thought I wanted to invite some friends to talk about some of these old classic books. Classic. When I say classic, I mean,
I know.
80s, 90s, early 2000s popular evangelical books. So I thought, Jerry, I want to introduce you to my people, and I think we
Hey,
could have an
hey,
interesting conversation. So welcome.
hey, thank you. And the word classic is a painful one nowadays. I was driving for Uber about a year ago and I had my radio on a classic rock station because it's kind of neutral.
Oh no, oh no.
Imagine Dragons came on the air. And I was like, I am way too young for that to be on the air. No, no, no. I am calling the station.
How
I had a
dare.
passenger with me, and the passenger was in her like 30s, and she's like, I'm with you. This is not okay.
How dare they?
I had
We
to
are
find a new station.
young.
Imagine Dragons. I'm
I
like,
had one of
no.
those wake up calls the other day. I brought my 16-year-old to the doctor and he's like, "Hey, what have you been doing, Isaac?" And Isaac like, "I just finished reading this book. It's about 50 years old." And I was like, "That book is 50
Yeah,
years
get
old."
out.
And it was All the President's Men, written in
Oh,
like 74. And then I thought, I too
oh,
originated in the 70s.
yes.
And
Oh
I am
man.
almost 50 years old. So thanks. Thanks, Isaac. Thanks
Yeah.
for that reminder.
I feel your pain. I feel your
That's
pain.
right. This book we're talking about today was published in 1995, which I hate to tell you, 30 years ago.
Yeah.
That's wild.
Wow.
We're talking about Left Behind.
Yes.
I read this book when it first came out. I bought those books when they were right hot off the press. I loved them. They had this formula to them. They had a little bit of action adventure. Every book had someone that was saved, somebody that died tragically,
Yeah.
and some like mystery and like what could happen next. I really enjoyed them. As I am a little more removed from this, I thought this is a great book to revisit to see like what actually is happening in this book. How did it impact the culture? And I learned some things. I actually picked up the 25th anniversary edition of the book that had an interesting introduction to it by Jerry
Really?
Jenkins, who was one of the co-authors. And
Yeah.
he said that like here part of the origin story of this book is that the two authors, Tim LaHaye and Jerry Jenkins, didn't know each other before. They
Oh wow.
shared a common agent. Tim LaHaye wrote fiction books. He was very much into, or he wrote nonfiction books, very much into prophecy. And he thought, how can I get people to be interested? I should write a novel. He didn't know how to write a novel. So he had an
Mhm.
idea with no skill. And his agent was like,
It's a
hey,
great mix.
I know a novelist who doesn't have an idea.
Oh
What if I
yes.
introduced the two of you to each other?
Oh wow. Yeah,
And
I
so
wondered. Yeah.
I think the agent is like, I'm not sure that's exactly how it happened. Jerry Jenkins says that's how it happened.
Yeah.
Jerry Jenkins ended up being the one who wrote the book. Tim LaHaye had the idea, the
Yes.
brainchild for it, and he just said, I don't want to write any of the words, but I'll tell you what the correct theology is of eschatology, which is like the big $1,000 word for
Yeah.
end times. That is how that book happened. And I think that is wild that they didn't
Yeah.
even know each other. Most books at that time in the Christian like publishing industry that were like novels would be like paperback or pocketbook size. And so they thought, we're going to take a risk on this and maybe do a hardcover. But
Oh wow.
I learned in reading those little jacket covers for the hardcover are as expensive as the book itself. And they're like, we don't know how this is going to do. So they ordered more books than jacket covers. We're like, just in case it doesn't sell. Just in case it
Oh
doesn't
wow. So you
sell.
still stuck with a book, but you didn't waste all that money on the jacket cover itself.
So they had to actually do another run of the jacket cover that ended up being a little bit different than the original one. So maybe
Oh
if you
wow.
have original, that could be worth
Yeah.
something.
Oh wow.
So I
Yeah, I never
learned that.
bought a copy. When I got into the series, I was already a Christian by then, but it was like we're talking like 2008-ish, 2009, and I
Okay, yeah.
was
So
spending a
they were
lot of
old.
money on books. Yeah. at a time we weren't making a lot of money, my wife said, "Look, you're gonna have to get a library card. If you're reading a book a week, you got to get a library card." And there was a series that was recommended by my men's group
Okay.
and a few other folks, more of like the older crowd, like the guys who were 10 years older than me were like, "Oh, you got to read this book." I'm like, "Well, I saw the movie with Kirk Cameron, so I don't own a single copy of it, but I think I read up to like Nikolai, and then after that,
Yes.
and spoiler
I
alert,
don't know that I read all of them. Spoiler.
yeah,
Nikolai is a bad
uh,
guy.
but I think I stopped after Chloe, after her demise, and I was like, "Ah,
I
well,
know. They
I'm
broke our
out."
heart in killing
Yeah,
someone off in every book. But
yeah, it was kind
someone
of the
came to know the Lord in every book too. So,
yeah,
I
yeah, it
mean,
was
it's
like
kind of a mixed
it's kind of
mixed
a one for
bag.
one trade, right? It was like,
I'm
you
gonna
want to
say
go to
your
heaven?
wife
Yeah,
is
save, get
smart.
somebody saved.
I would say your wife is smart in encouraging you to do the library card
Yeah.
because there are 16 books
Oh
in
yeah.
that series.
Yeah.
Did you know the initial idea was one book?
Really?
It was going to be one book that covered all the prophecies, all the things.
Oh
But Jerry
wow.
Jenkins starts writing and he gets like 2 weeks into the timeline of the
Hmm.
story and he's like, Tim, what if we did a trilogy?
A trilogy.
The trilogy
Does
has
he know
turned
it?
into
Yeah.
16.
I don't think he understood trilogy if he did 16 books.
I know. They just kept going. And so he had a lot of story to tell.
Oh,
It made the New York Times bestseller list starting in 2000. Book 7 and 8 reached number one on the list.
wow.
Book 10 debuted at number one. And then the Wikipedia article I was reading said that as of 2016, 65 million copies had been sold.
Wow.
Yeah, I
It's very
mean, that's a nice retirement.
yeah.
I don't know what the agreement was and what the royalties were, but that is nice. Of course, because it was such a huge deal, people asked them, they'd be interviewed, why do you think this was so popular? And the authors speculated that maybe it was because it was so close to the turn of the century, the
Hmm.
millennium. 1995, the first book was published. People were thinking, what might happen to the world?
Yeah.
There might be some significant changes happening, maybe
And there
in
were, you know.
2000.
When did the Soviet Union collapse? That was like
Isn't it?
92,
Yeah, it was like in
93.
the early 90s. Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you
Uh,
remember the speculation? If you weren't a believer at the time, my dad reminded me of this, that there was a speculation that Gorbachev was the Antichrist because he had like this um,
of the birthmark.
birthmark on his
Yeah.
forehead.
And you see that carry over into the books that the Antichrist
Yes.
just happens to be Romanian slash Soviet
Yes.
Carpathian. And it's
Yes.
like, what if he isn't? What if he's from, I don't know, somewhere else? And
I don't know.
it's just
How dare you
not,
ask that question, Jerry?
I
This is
know,
settled. This
I
theology
know.
was settled by Tim LaHaye. Another funny thing about
Uh,
this, the origin, is that this plot came to Tim LaHaye says he was on a plane flying back from a
oh,
conference. He
wow. And like,
sees the pilot appear to be flirting with a flight attendant. The pilot
yeah.
has a wedding ring on. The flight attendant didn't. And he's like,
Mm,
what if he's like getting ready to have an affair with this woman? And what if I made this into a story and the pilot's wife is at home and she's a believer and he never really bought into it.
yeah.
And at this moment, the rapture happens and he
Wow.
knows because somewhere in his head, he knows the truth because he listened to his wife but disregarded it for so long. That's the origin story of
Wow.
like the
Wow.
kickoff
The
to this
redemption
book.
arc of a pilot who could possibly be having an extramarital affair.
But maybe he wasn't. Like, who knows? Tim might have misread all
Oh
those
yeah,
cues
yeah.
on that, but
Uh,
that, I mean, 65 million books plus
yeah.
later. I mean,
Yeah. I watched the movie first, the one with Kirk Cameron.
yes, they've done several
And
versions of this, right?
yes, I've seen the one with Kirk Cameron, and then there was a really low budget one done in the like around 97, 98. And I only got exposed to that one because by my senior year, I had to do like one more semester, but my lease on my apartment was up, and I didn't have enough time to get like housing on campus and all that stuff. And so a nice retired couple who knew the lady who managed the apartments where I used to stay, they were like, "We'll rent you a room for X number of dollars a month, and you could stay with us. The food in the fridge, that's yours as well." Very nice couple. Like as I reflect on, their generosity, I realized how disrespectful I was into their home, and they were still so gracious. But all that to say, I also had free reign to like watch any of the videos, that the VHS tapes that they had in their
Okay,
collection,
yes,
and I had
yes.
watched pretty much everything. I didn't have enough money to go to a Blockbuster and rent something that clearly they weren't going to be okay with anyway, so I had to refrain from that. And then there was this uh video, and the cover just looked really cool. It was like Armageddon like, and I'm like, I'm gonna
Yeah.
give it a shot, and I threw it in there, and it was all about the rapture. Apparently in this video, when you got raptured, God also nicely and neatly folded your clothes for you and put them in a stack. So if you were a truck driver and you got raptured like that,
Boom.
somebody, oh, one, your truck came to a nice complete halt, nobody got hurt, so somebody would run up to your truck cab, open the door, and there were your clothes, nice pressed and folded. I'm like, that was very considerate of God.
And their shoes. I bet their shoes
Yeah,
were
and your
there
shoes
too.
were just nice and placed neatly at the foot of wherever you were. Now, I was not a believer. I didn't become a believer until 2005.
Wow.
So this is like 1998. And I'm like, I'm laughing. And I'm like, this is
Did
ridiculous.
was that Thief in the Night?
Maybe. I'd
Did it
have to
have
see the cover
guillotines in it?
again.
Did it also have guillotines in it for people?
I don't know. I don't
A little
remember
scary.
actually finishing the movie. I just remember seeing the rapture part of it, and I was like, I'm done. I'm gonna watch Much Ado About Nothing. Like that fit. They're okay.
Emma Thompson and Kenneth Branagh version.
Yes, yeah,
So
the one that
good.
Denzel Washington and
So
Keanu
good.
Reeves.
I
Keanu Reeves
know.
belting out Shakespearean lines.
We should talk
Uh,
about Much Ado.
oh man,
That is one of the best Shakespearean comedies ever.
Michael
I
Keaton's
am
role as the
sent against
constable,
my will to bid you come into dinner. There's a double meaning in that. I love that so
right?
much.
Oh
I'll put
man.
a link to that in
Um,
the show notes. If you
so
finish watching one of the versions of the Left Behind
I
movies,
I
Kirk Cameron's in
watched
one. Wasn't Nick Cage in one, I think?
he was, yeah, I didn't see that one, but I did watch the one with Kirk Cameron
Mhm.
all the way through because that came out in what, 2000. I hadn't met Olivia yet, and I was visiting. This is like right after a tour in Kosovo. I'd come back to visit my mom for Christmas, and we agreed. Like my brother was there also, and then her and her boyfriend at the time, my mom and her boyfriend, and we said, let's go rent some movies at Blockbuster. And she saw that movie, and I guess her pastor had talked about it, and she's like, we got to watch this movie. I'm like, okay, fair's fair. I mean, we got her watching Die Hard 2 on Christmas, so
Yes.
let's do this. And um, so a little bit nice in that, apparently when you got raptured, your clothes didn't get folded. So I'm still not a Christian, but I'm watching this and I'm like, well, Kirk Cameron's in it. Like how weird can it be? Uh, and I know nothing about the Bible enough to like
Famous last
question.
words.
And I'm like, oh wow, okay, so he's a reporter. Okay, got that. Pilot, he's up to no good. That's shame on him. But like all the other stuff, like the military thing at the beginning, I was like, but the Soviet Union has fallen. They don't have the capability to attack Israel.
You asked too many questions, Jerry.
Yeah, yeah.
Too
From,
many questions.
from a geopolitical standpoint, I was like, why would the whole world attack Israel? Besides, Israel has a track record of like being the underdog in the last
Yeah.
70 years. So like that
Yeah.
was kind of going out the window for me. And I'm like, besides, the US wouldn't be in on this. But if anybody had the military might to do something, it would be the US. What if we're the bad? And I just came from a deployment in Kosovo.
Yeah.
So I already saw like our military capability stacked up with like Russia's and Ukraine at the time and so on. And I was like, if anybody has the capability to logistically go anywhere in the world at any time and be there in a heartbeat, undetected, it would be the United States. So if anybody militarily could pull this attack off, it would be us.
Oh
And
dear.
that would
I'm getting
mean
worried
the
now.
US would have to be the bad guy in this.
Yeah.
And so that was already like one tick mark there. And then the acting was relatively decent for me, like from what I expected, because my first exposure to a Christian movie was the other
Very
rapture
B
movie.
movie, yeah.
Yeah, it
So you
was.
weren't able to completely suspend your disbelief with
No, because I
your
wasn't even a Christian
experience.
yet. So everything was being questioned. And I'm like,
What's
um,
interesting though is you came to this 10 years after they first were
yes.
started being published. And so I wonder, I don't know exactly what's happening in the world, the political world in 1995, that somehow this would have probably seemed, I don't know, maybe
Yeah.
reasonable, maybe
Well,
not.
the world order was changing. I mean, Soviet Union
Yeah.
fell in the early 90s, late 80s. The United Nations was taking more of a presence in the world. Like you had the
Yeah.
conflict in Bosnia, Herzegovina, and people were asking the UN, step in, please step in and do something. And the world really had shifted. The United States became the only superpower in the world. Soviet Union had fallen and was breaking up into other countries. Then you had the rise of China. China's like, hey, if Russia ain't gonna do it, for the motherland, I guess we could do it for ourselves. And so they start growing and thinking about, their resource needs. They're starting to reach like 1 billion people. So the idea of um, the need for resources, the need for food, even how do we feed a
Yeah.
billion people in our country? India was reaching 1 billion people as well. And I don't know exactly what was going on in Israel, but I think that's kind of helped the kind of bring all this turmoil together. If things are shaking up, and whoever
Yeah.
rises up now is probably going to be the Antichrist. It's probably going to be like whatever comes out of the UN, apparently, because the US can
Right.
never have the bad guy. And I was just like, huh, this is interesting. So uh
Yeah, I had an interesting conversation that helped me kind of think through the theology and different approaches, and in learning that this reading of how the world ends
mhm,
is actually very new and not held to by serious Bible scholars. I had a
mm.
conversation with Dr. Scott McKnight, who wrote Revelation for the rest of us. I asked him, I asked him if he
I
had
need to write that
read
down.
these books, but I highly recommend Revelation for the rest of us. And he says, this was really very much inspired by a guy who actually just passed away. Um, Hal Lindsey wrote The Late Great Planet Earth. I don't know, maybe in the 70s. And it ended up taking the evangelical world by storm. And he was like, this is how it's going to be. This is what I believe to be true. And I think we take for granted that because it was so influential and so formed people's understanding, more than even people's reading of scripture, is that this guy, Hal Lindsey, probably very much informed Tim LaHaye's theology of thinking, okay, there's going to be this physical rapture for sure. And then after that, the people that are believers are going to be taken up physically just like that. And that after that, there will be a literal 7 years of really bad things happening where an antichrist figure is going to rise to power. And then Jesus will come back and reign for 1,000 years. Like, this was like, of course, this is how everybody reads Revelation and all the other prophecies, when that isn't actually how serious scholars have approached Revelation. Dr. McKnight said, most people that know what they're talking about don't bring their newspaper in one hand and the Bible in the other and say,
Yeah.
what's happening in the newspaper that possibly is reflected from Revelation? And he said, really, a lot of this is symbolism of things that have already happened. And it's like a big story of good versus evil.
Mhm.
And good winning out in the end. And it was like this big play played out. And like, who are
Yeah.
we going to side with, the kingdom of goodness or the kingdom of darkness? But according to Left Behind and Tim LaHaye, now we have a lot of people that are like looking in their newspapers and saying, what's happening in the world?
Mhm.
And who could possibly be the bad guy? And we never think we
Yeah.
are. We never
Oh, never.
think.
No.
It's always
Especially
going
in
to
a
be the other political party. And we are very America-centric when that has come to this idea of reading the idea of the end times. This dispensationalist approach is what it's called of
oh wow, it's got fancy words.
um I know, as that's $1 million word. It had to do with like the understanding of Jesus coming back at this time. There's going to be an antichrist, then the tribulation. And to think that over the however many thousands of years that the scriptures have been around, to think that this would be really about America is really crazy.
Yeah.
It's really wild to think. I do want to say a little brief synopsis of what was happening in the book is that, I mentioned that we have this pilot who is flying the plane. Suddenly, half the people are missing. I don't remember what happened with their clothes in the book, if they were like neatly
Oh.
folded. if they were
I think
still
it's
there,
just
but the people were gone.
there, like a
I
pile
don't
of
know if they
clothes.
mentioned the
Yeah.
clothes. In this book, Israel had recently become a really prosperous nation. Do you remember that? Because, it had
Mhm.
been a drought, and then this guy had invented this way to basically bring vegetation from a desert. And it was
Yeah.
changing the world. And so Israel had like more money and power than almost any nation. They are shadowy figures that are in the background pulling the strings of government. And then there's a charming Russian leader that comes on the stage and they mention, reminds people a little bit of Gorbachev, which I think is hilarious that they mentioned that. And he looks like Brad Pitt, they said in the book. He looks like Brad Pitt.
Yeah.
That
I
he had
wonder.
actually been named the sexiest man alive and dethroned, like out of order. Like somebody
Oh
had
wow.
already been named the sexiest man, and they're like, you know what? Carpathia is here, and he's actually the sexiest. So we're not going to wait till next year. We're just going to say you're the guy. Also, Times Person of the Year, won the Nobel Peace Prize. There's a lot
Oh,
of
oh wow.
conspiracy theories that are embraced in this. Like there must be a shadowy government thing happening in the background.
Yeah.
And then
Yeah.
we have this main,
Everything's a
yeah,
cabal of some kind, and you're like,
yeah,
what? Huh? I was actually just quickly Googling, like, when did Putin start to rise? But he wasn't prime minister until August 1999. But he's kind of moving up in the ranks as well as like the head of, what was he in charge of, KGB, Security Council,
yes,
uh,
yes.
Federal Security Service. So what the KGB became is what he was director of, and then politically, I think people are starting to see him rising up. He's starting to become a little bit more vocal. But again, he doesn't come into a leadership role in over the country until 1999. But you got
Yeah,
that guy as well, and he was younger at that time. But yeah, just very interesting. Very, yeah, like you said, American centric. Because it's written for a very specific audience in a sense. The American evangelical umbrella is
yeah,
is
yeah,
who this is targeting in a way. And like my mom has, been a part of that. She went to a Baptist church for a long time, and see, at the time she was living in, yeah, North Carolina, but she'd also lived in Alabama and moved to North Carolina. So a lot of that influence was there. And but yeah, I mean, seeing that before I was a Christian, very,
yeah, yeah.
I scoffed at it a lot just because I was looking at it from a secular point of view.
And
And my mom she's a big sucker for anything apocalyptic that is
yes,
also tied to the Bible. She's always, ever since I was a little kid, loved watching that kind of thing. Like, look, this is going to come true someday. And then it's like, it's come and it's past. And, we're also watching this because my mom is still hoping that and praying
yeah,
that my son is going to become a Christian and he's going to have influence as a Christian. And I'm like, please, I graduated with a degree in chemistry biology. I'm trying to become a doctor. Becoming a Christian's the last thing on my list. And
yeah,
then my now wife of 23 years, and she apparently made a deal with God that if he brought me home from war, that she would make sure we went to church. And apparently I made a deal with God, if he brought me home, well, no, when I died, he'd replace me with somebody better than me. And I didn't understand the whole symbolism behind that. And he's like, yeah, you're the replacement. So you're going to kind of die spiritually, and then you're going to come
yeah,
back
yeah,
somebody new. And I'm like, what? But I didn't learn that until like 2007, 2008, and realized that that's what all came together and led to me being saved in 2005. But when I read the book series up to Nikolai in the later part of the 2000s, early, the first decade of the 2000s, again, it was because men in my men's group were like, you got to read this. This is very powerful. This is a lot of what's happening in our world today. But I think it was around the time Barack Obama was running for president, and people
mm-hmm.
were saying that he was now the Antichrist. And I was like, wait, didn't we all say that Clinton was the Antichrist when he was running? And some people kind of speculated that Saddam Hussein was the Antichrist, and he wasn't, apparently. Like, we're saying all these different people are like, we're just moving the label. Like, okay, Osama bin Laden turned out not to be the Antichrist.
Yeah,
It was Hussein, Saddam Hussein. Yes, yes. No, no,
yeah,
no. It wasn't Saddam. It was one of his two sons. It's one of those two guys. We got to stop them at all costs. And then it was like, hmm, Barack Obama, very charismatic, very different. We
yeah.
don't know
He's
where he
very
really
well
came
loved.
from.
So,
Yeah. And we don't know
worldwide.
where he really came from. And so all of a sudden it was like, he's the Antichrist. And I think that's part of why this particular person in my men's group recommend I read the book series.
Yeah,
And so I did. I'm like, okay, that's kind of cool. Is there a rapture? I don't, we're going through the Bible, and I think I was on year 2 of my attempt to read the 1 year Bible. It took me like 3 to 5 years to read the 1 year Bible.
yes,
Uh,
yes.
and I hadn't quite gotten to a Revelation yet. But I mean, I was because of that book series, I was skipping forward a lot. I'm like, okay, there's some sort of angel with like animal heads. Well, this one's got like all the eyeballs. That's not
Yeah,
in this book. But then it kind of hit me like, Jesus had said we don't really know the exact time or hour when the end times are coming. And I'm like, so why am I reading an entire book series about when the end times are coming if Jesus himself
it's
didn't
interesting.
know the
Yeah.
exact timing? And I'm like, this is just all
Yeah, because
entertaining.
there's so much discussion. My grandma, she wanted to read about prophecy
Mhm.
and she read these books. She would keep a list of all the characters because there's so many characters to keep up with at some point to
Yeah.
be like, who are we talking about? But she read this as literal. And when I was doing, research and, seeing that Wikipedia article about Left Behind, they said that Jerry Falwell said that about this first book in the series that in terms of its impact on Christianity, it's probably greater than that of any other book in modern times outside the
Wow.
Bible.
Yeah.
People read this like it is the Bible, which
Yes.
is sort of wild.
That part's scary. That, for me, reading it was entertaining and it got me to read my Bible
Sure.
and try to cross-reference. So where did the rapture happen? Is there a rapture? And then I started Googling. I'm like, okay, a lot of people think there isn't going to be one. I'm like, okay, that's kind of cool. So all my joking about being left behind, like I would always joke about that because people,
The Larry
again,
Norman song. Did you hear the
yeah,
song?
it's like, you know what?
I wish we'd all been ready. Yeah.
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 And I would always like joke around, like, given the story of my life, I am the guy that would basically be thrown into a crisis situation or a chaotic situation after everybody else has run. And it would just kind of fall on me, like, okay, try to fix this scenario. I'm like, if there is a rapture, I know for a fact God's going to leave me behind. But then I think the part that really blew my mind was this whole idea of like at one point they all decide we're gonna fight back against
Yeah.
Carpathia. We're
Yeah.
gonna form the tribulation force. We're going
Yes.
to undermine his attempts to deceive the world. But for us to form a clandestine group of people who are untrained in the ways of
Yeah.
whatever Carpathia has at his disposal, like special forces people, agents, and so on, we're going to create this network of spies and guerrilla fighters, and we're going to take on Carpathia. Like
Yeah.
now, from an entertainment standpoint, now and what I now understand of the Bible, you lost me. I think that's
Yeah.
when I stopped reading the book
Yeah.
series. Was that? But all that to say, it did at least inspire me to read the Bible more intentionally, really think about what it means.
Yeah,
Um,
I think that can be the value in some of these things. If
yeah,
you don't just stop at being discipled by the Left Behind series, if
yeah,
it brings you to, okay, this entertained me, it was interesting, a little bit of like a Christian version of Tom Clancy,
hmm,
and now we are going to actually open up God's word and see what it says. And we're like, oh, this is the fictional part. This was the
yes,
speculation. This is actually what it says. My concern about this is I just wonder about the influence it's had. And I think it's had a long history of making evangelical Christians speculate and fearful and suspicious about enemies and making people
hmm,
into enemies that they're wrong. They aren't enemies.
yeah,
And getting this wrong has resulted, I think, in a lot of really poor decisions, like how we handle the pandemic. When you think some of these leaders are maybe the Antichrist and they may be doing all of this to keep us out of church and trying to
yeah,
fool us, like, I'm not going to fall for that. I'm going to be one of the tribulation force that fights back, right? It's a
yeah,
sincerely held belief, but it is based on a fiction and
yes,
not actual words of Jesus and things that are outlined clearly in the Bible. Like to not
yeah,
say, you know what, I don't know. I could be wrong on this interpretation. And I think it causes people to major on the minor things. Most important thing we're supposed to do is to love God and love our neighbors ourselves. And if
yes.
we're so busy just scrolling the news to see and trying to speculate, is this the bad guy? Is this the one? Is this the end? And it's also, I talked to somebody who thought it might actually have influenced how many evangelical Christians think about taking care of the world because
Mhm.
they think that taking care of the earth, it's all gonna, it's going up in flames anyways. They think, Jesus is coming back. It doesn't matter. I thought that
Yeah.
was like an interesting observation. I do think we have a long tail of sort of negative repercussions of thinking through the
Yeah.
world through this lens. I don't know what you think. Thoughts on that?
Very similar. I mean, going back to the pandemic, even I used to work in healthcare, doing leadership development within the hospital system where I worked, and going online and seeing like close friends of mine from the church I used to attend before I moved up here to Dallas, and they're saying everything counter to what was good for everybody's health. And
Mm,
these are some exact quotes. Don't fall for the evil cabal of child molesters and child traffickers who really
yeah.
just want to separate and break up the church. Like this whole pandemic thing, like you had said, is to keep us from going to church. And it's like, if we really read the Bible as opposed to like Left Behind as like this, there is this conspiracy to break up the church in the Bible met in people's houses, met in taverns, met in the town square, met right there in the tabernacle in front of the face of the Hebrews and the Jews. They met in small groups and then they would
Yeah.
disperse when the authorities came. And it's like there's nothing stopping us from gathering online. There's nothing stopping us from getting together as small pockets of people who hopefully are, you know, not bringing sickness and plague to each other. So it's not that big of a deal on a grand scale. We just don't want to cram 1,000 people together or 200 people together where 3 to 5% of them might be very contagious.
Because when there's uncertainty, people want to reach for some answer. And to feel like they have like a secret answer to everything is a lot more reassuring than to say, we don't know, we're doing our best.
Yeah.
And to not understand that as you have more information, of course, the best, the guidelines for what to do in the situation like this will change. And I
To
interrupted you. Go ahead.
Oh, I was going to say, yeah, the impact of that whole discussion around like this evil government plan to split up the church was that we now had a church body that was just enthralled and in just wrapped around this conspiracy theory that when you have people who are losing family members to an illness, rather than the body of Christ showing compassion for those families, we're saying, oh, it's because you fell for the trap of the enemy. And
Or being so sure that this is persecution of the
yes,
church, right?
and it was like that, when you think about like the Great Commission to go forth and make disciples of nations, and it's like, how did Jesus do it versus how we think it's to be done? And we weren't act as a church body. I don't think we were acting very Christ.
Like we'd been
To that
preparing for this
extent.
moment for
Yeah.
decades. Someone's going to come for us
Yes.
and cause us to make a line in the sand. Are we going to stand up for our faith or not? We've been told this is going to happen. People are going to hold a gun to our heads, and we're ready. We are so
And
ready.
we're like nowhere even near
We're
that.
going to either, bow to the government or we're going to choose Jesus. Did that come from Left Behind? Did that come from A Thief in the
Yeah.
Night? I don't think the government gets everything right. I think they've wrong a
Yeah. I mean, they're
lot.
people.
I
Yeah.
think there's just a lack of humility in so many of us when it
Yeah.
comes to trying to decipher what is happening in the world and what does it mean and how is God at work and is this something that was foretold? It's like you said, Jesus even said, we don't know. We don't know
Yeah.
the time or day. Here's the job we have to do. We need to be about
Yeah.
this job. The job isn't wondering who is the enemy that we need to protect ourselves from, and we end up choosing the wrong enemy. I listened to
Mhm.
a fascinating conversation that was actually recorded in the fall on the Bulletin podcast by Christianity Today. It was an
Oh, wow.
interview with Dr. Francis Collins. I highly recommend it. I'll link it in the show notes. But he talked about his experience in trying to lead as a man of science and a man of faith during the early days of that pandemic. And he even talked about the relief and how he just hit his knees in gratitude and crying when they finally saw the results of some of those early drug trials and seeing how effective it was, like 100% effective, how
Yeah.
grateful he was. And then also the disappointment and people didn't want it. People didn't believe it. And like I just was not prepared for the pushback. We didn't know we had to teach people about what the scientific method looked like. We didn't
Yes.
know we had to say, this is the best information we have now, and it might change. And that doesn't mean that we are misleading you. This is how science works.
Yeah.
We
You get more
test
information,
something and we say,
you
this is
get
the
more
information we
data.
have based on this, or to like try to do more explaining about this can be true and this can be true.
Yeah.
That we don't know this, or we thought this to be the case originally, and we were wrong. And people just did not have the ability to process that while they're scared and
Hmm.
already have a predetermined idea of who's out to get them and who isn't. And I just
Yeah.
thought it was really fascinating. And I just wonder if some of this whole end times world persecution complex ideas in our Christian context
Yeah.
has kind of failed us in
It's
that
like
regard.
you
And
had said
I'm
earlier,
sad about that. Yeah.
we've now shown up like with our Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other, and we're looking for events from today that link to
Yeah.
supposed prophecy. I remember one of my men's group sessions, this is a little over a decade ago, and one of the older guys in the group was talking about the end times and how, this administration, and it was, I think Obama was in the office at the time. And so this guy clearly was not a Democrat registered voter. And he was just like, it's just a matter of time before they make us all get the sign of the beast tattooed on us, or we have to have the number markings to be able to do business here and go to work. He was serious, very passionate. And he's like, okay, so we're not going to be able to do business unless we have some kind of a number assigned to us by the government. And that's going to be the mark of the beast. Don't we already have to have a social security number to
That's why some people
fill a
have
W-2?
rejected. That's why some people pushed back against the Social
Yeah.
Security numbers
They almost
initially.
kicked me out of my own group. I'm like, wait, I'm the leader of this group. I mean, I'll start a new one, but like,
Yeah.
come
Yeah.
on, like let's chill out a bit. The microchips or the nanobots in the vaccine, throw some critical thinking in
What
there.
if the most likely explanation is the right one? Possible,
Yeah,
like the easiest explanation.
the other
You said
movie.
that you've been like led some men's groups.
Yeah,
Yeah, there's so many magical things that can happen in community. I was asking about that because I really feel like I keep hearing more and more smart people say, really what the best scenario is when we can actually engage with scripture in community with other
yeah,
people because we can hear other different people bring their different experiences to it. Somebody's bringing their left behind to their reading of Revelation, and somebody else is saying, I've heard that not every person that is a sincere follower of Jesus actually believes the exact same thing about that. And here's some
yeah,
other things. And I just think it's so valuable to be able to
yeah,
show up in those spaces, virtual or in person, and say, what is actually going on here?
yes.
And that you can say, I've actually been in the military too. And can I tell you a little bit about how that sort of explanation doesn't really make sense? And just such a really beautiful richness that happens when we get different perspectives coming together with it, understanding that we want to understand God's word better. And
Yeah.
we might get it wrong. There's an art
Um,
to those conversations, right? So I
yeah.
want to ask you, if somebody were telling you about reading Left Behind, would you be like, "Hey, buddy, don't read that book"? How would you like, would you recommend it? What's good about it? What wouldn't you recommend about it? What are your thoughts?
Yeah.
2025, Jerry, when it comes
Oh
to
man.
somebody that's like,
Uh,
"Oh, you guys, I'm at Bible study now, and all of y'all should read this book, this series. It'll change your life."
uh, very similarly, like I wouldn't just say butt heads with them, say,
Yeah.
mom, that book's total garbage. Like I wouldn't like just butt heads right off the bat, although that tends to be a tempting thing to do. But I'd ask questions like, okay, so why should we tackle that series? What is it about that series that'll draw us closer to God? And is there like a study companion that goes with this, or what kind of discussion are we going to have? Just curious about what we're getting into and what direction we're going in, and how much discussion we're really going to have, and just be that question asker, not in a combative
Yeah,
way,
that's good. I love that.
but
Being a question asker is good. Yeah. How is this
there's
making us like Jesus? That's
which
interesting.
which really would
So,
be the mission of the tribulation force anyway, right? Like, hey, we got a limited amount of time. Let's make sure people know about the gospel,
yeah,
and
maybe our
until we get to,
tribulation force should be focused not on taking out the Antichrist,
yeah,
but on loving our neighbors and being faithful followers of Jesus. So, what's your star rating? And I keep
shame on you,
forgetting and I
podcaster.
keep like changing Like I think it was on a scale from like 1 to 5 that I started with this. So I think I need to stick with that. But I feel like I need to go back and readjust now that I've
Yeah.
normalized. Like maybe I gave that first one too low of a rating, that it wasn't really terrible. It just wasn't great.
Oh,
So one to
I
five, I would say five would be the worst. Five would be dangerous.
yeah. Well,
Absolutely
five is dangerous.
avoid at all costs, right?
Ah,
Yeah. And no,
so
no, one would be dangerous. Sorry.
yeah,
One
so
one
five
is
is
like
great.
dangerous. Five
Everybody
is the
should read it,
best. All the
believe it through
stars,
and through.
change your
Um,
life, make you more
so
like Jesus.
as a book series, I'd give it a 3 in terms
Mhm.
of Pulp Fiction quality. If I want entertainment, grab this. It's very, very fun, very interesting to read. Not difficult to read because it does get repetitive after a while. I even
Who's
saw
gonna
some.
die? Who's gonna get saved?
Exactly. Yeah. Who's it this time? Whoa, he got married. Oh, she's dying in the next book. Sorry,
Yeah,
guys.
yep.
Spoiler there. So I started at a 3, but then when we start talking about like its accuracy to the Bible and
Yeah, yeah,
trying to predict real life events, and then that influence and how it really isn't aligned with what a lot of scholars of the Bible have said and what I've learned over the years, I would downgrade it even further to a 2. Like if you take
if you're
that
looking at it
same
for theology, yeah, that's it.
yeah. So
Yeah,
I would even go as far as a 2. And then the reason why it's not a 1 is because in my own experience, it at least inspired me to read the Bible more and pay
yeah,
attention more and
yeah,
try to find the parallels. Like, okay, where is it accurate? uh,
yeah,
and what does the Bible really say? And what does the
yeah.
Bible
I'm
really
tracking with you there.
mean? Yeah. So I would take it to a 2 because of that potential to inspire us to actually read the Bible and make
Yeah.
meaning of that.
I'm not gonna argue you out of that because I feel the same way. I feel like right there in the middle, I try not to like do a cop out like middle of the line
Mhm.
star all the time, but I do think in this case it's interesting. It can
Yeah.
be entertaining. If you want an interesting book to read and you come to it with the idea this is speculative and wildly comes with somebody's preconceived notions of what they believe all this stuff is
Yeah.
going to be. And with that understanding, not that like this is going to help me figure out how the end of the world is happening and who the bad guy is, you know, read it for fun. Why not?
Yeah.
I'm not going to
Oh yeah.
say sneak into your library and secretly grab them and burn them. I don't think they're dangerous in that way. If I knew somebody loved these books and w was like mentioning them in current events and or seem like their understanding of current events seemed to be formed by this sort of thing,
Yeah.
I would want to have more conversations with them about like tell me like w where these ideas came from and maybe to push back on the idea that there are all these deep conspiracies people out to
Yeah.
get us that can have real life consequences that can be devastating if we're wrong about
Yes.
these
And we
things.
hadn't even like brought in like the influence of Nostradamus into the
Oh my goodness.
uh
Yes,
but
yes.
if we're winding down, one of the things I did want to point out was that having been around since 1976, but probably really thinking about so at least since middle school and the start of high school, I've heard Saddam Hussein being referred to as the Antichrist or the person who's going to bring the end of the world. According to Nostradamus,
Yep.
turned out to not be the case. The fall of the Soviet Union was going to be the end of the world because the New World Order is going to be driven and led by the Antichrist. So far, I haven't seen anything to conclude that. The year 2000 was the end of the world.
Yeah.
2012 was the end of the world according to the Mayan calendar. There's somebody who wrote about like blood moons,
Yeah.
and apparently the world has ended a bunch of times, and none of the predictions.
Or is about to be. Yeah.
Yes, and like when you read the breakdown of like there was a blood moon on this date. Well, did you know 10,000 years ago this bad event happened? I'm like, so the blood moon predicted something would happen 10,000 years later. Well, that does me no good. I'm going to be gone long before that happens. And
Yeah.
so it's like prophecies come with a grain of salt. Like when they start getting specific, like on May 17th, 2025, Jerry's going to stub his toe and that's going to trigger nuclear war. Trust me, that's
Yeah.
probably baloney.
Yeah. 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 And I
Yeah.
think you start to see a pattern too of like,
Yes.
hey, this person has said that so many times and it's been wrong so many times. This is not a credible
Yeah.
person. The most influential person to this sort of theology that we're talking about, Hal Lindsey, that he was that person. He wrote so many books and had so many dates that he chose for when the end of the world was going to
Mhm.
happen. You know, he made a lot of money. He made a lot of people anxious, and he was wrong every single
Yes.
time.
And I think Jesus gave us the perfect solution. You don't know when it's coming, so just be ready.
Yeah,
You know, this is me paraphrasing. Like the message I got was strive to be more like Jesus every day. Make it on earth as it is in heaven. You know, help somebody out, and yeah, just live your life as good of a Christian as you can. Represent Jesus as best as possible. Admit when you make mistakes. Stay humble, and when those times come, you're ready.
right. Yeah,
And if those times don't come for another 2 generations, hopefully the way you led your life now inspired your kids to be like
yeah,
you, to be more like Christ. And
yeah,
then their kids also strive to be more like them, which was more like you because you made a decision to be more like Jesus.
yeah. And getting this exactly right isn't the most important thing when it
Yeah.
comes to following Jesus. There's not going to be a test on the end times when it's all said and done. It doesn't really matter.
Yeah.
So. Jerry, this
Exactly.
has been fun to talk.
Yes.
I think I
Same
need to
here.
have you back sometime and ask you more deep questions about other books we have read
Cool.
or other things.
Or at least seen the
What
movie on, right?
That's right. I want people to know where they can find you because you use your voice for your job in
Yes.
several different ways. So tell us how we can find you or support you.
Yeah. I still have my podcast up and running, beyondtherut.com. And for 2025, I decided to kind of do the Pirates of the Caribbean thing. So you have the ride that inspired the movie franchise. The movie franchise has now influenced the ride to improve, just kind of create this loop. And I thought, the podcast inspired this book, Beyond the Rut, Create a Life Worth Living in Your Faith, Family, and Career. What if it's now time for the book to inspire the podcast? So the podcast is doing a 26-week program where I'm just taking concepts from the book and challenging people to do some reflection, create some action steps for themselves, and go live that life that's beyond the rut in their faith, family, and career. So beyondtherut.com is where you can find that podcast, that 26-week series. And then for my voice work, I branched into the world of voiceover, and that is at jerryduganvoice.com. And my demos are up there, a way to get in touch with me. So if you work for a company doing online learning, you got an audiobook, you don't want to narrate, but you want an audiobook, I'm your guy. So yeah,
So
that's where you can
cool.
find me.
Thanks so much, Jerry. This has been fun.
Same here, Amy.